to use. And that tool is dua. Like, when we used to go out and do street dawah in Houston. And I remember we would take a bunch of brothers, we'd go out and, speak to people and things like that. And I actually remember the first time I went, there's a place in Houston, and again, this is maybe 15 years ago, it's called Monteros, right? So this place, Monteros, what I didn't know at the time is that is where all of the homosexuals hang out. And my dawah partner, Khalil, he basically took me straight there, right? Now let me remind you of the context. This is 15 years ago, so not like today where we've almost become acclimated to the idea. So then it was like shocking, And I remember he came up and he was like, okay, you're going to make dawah to this person, and he's like, well, I'm homosexual. I told Khalil, I'm like, yo, that's all you, man. I'm not dealing with that, right? But going out, I always used to encourage the brothers that before you go out and before you start speaking to people, make a dua to Allah that Allah would guide someone at your hands. Because guidance is not in your hands. It's not your argument. It's not, all of these epistemic tools or other rational to whatever tools we're giving. These are just tools. At the end of the day, the one who's going to guide that person is Allah, right? And sometimes what happens is that if you want guidance for someone, yes, you've got the tools, but maybe you're missing tahajjud. Maybe you don't want it bad enough for that person, right? I hear people all the time, yeah, I was speaking to my coworker, and I really, he's not getting convinced. And I would ask the person, I said, when did you make dua for him? And they're taking a step back, like, oh, well, I didn't think about that. Okay, well, let's start with that, man. If you really want guidance, you really want this person to not enter the fire of hell, right? Which is what you should want. How much dua have you made for him? Have you gotten up in the last third of the night and begged Allah to guide this person, right? So those type of things, just as a reminder, yes, we get into a lot of nuances about the arguments and things like that, but don't lose sight. Keep your eye on the ball, right? And don't get on a train to Never Never Land where it's just about you and winning the argument, right? So I know I sound like a broken record, but I think it's really important that we understand that very clearly, right? Because you get sucked in, and it happens no matter, conversations, that's just the nature of how it is. And that's the nature of shaitan as well. He wants you to get into jidal, right? Argumentation without any sort of benefit. Okay? So just as a reminder, just to keep that in mind, inshallah, before we start today. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do that yet. So let me just get to where we were, inshallah, and continue from there. So I'm going to escape here for a second and just scroll down. Oops, that's not what I wanted. We had that. All right. So we had spoken about science. We had spoken about, is God merciful? I'm actually going to move forward because of time, inshallah. So, my apologies about this. Just want to... Okay. So I'm going to put it up to you guys. We can do, inshallah, we're going to cover both subjects, but I'll tell you the order and I'll let you guys, we'll have a democratic vote. Okay? The two topics, inshallah, that we're going to cover, and hopefully a third, the two topics that I'd like to definitely cover is, number one, the Qur'an's argument for the existence of Allah. That's number one. Number two is how to show that the Qur'an is from Allah without reference to the Arabic language. So which one would you guys like to do first? So who wants to do the Qur'an's argument? Okay, got a few people here. Who wants to do how to show the Qur'an is from Allah without? You voted twice, man. What's going on? You didn't? You did it once? Okay, all right. Maybe my eyes were deceiving me. All right, so go ahead. Once again, so I think most of us want to do the Qur'an. Okay, so now let me jump down to those slides, and then we'll go from there, inshallah, and we'll come back to this. And by the way, this course is quite long, as you can tell. So let me see here. Actually, you know what? We may have to do the Qur'an's argument and then do the because the slides aren't in this deck. So The decision's been made for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this, and then I'll have to look up the slides from the other topic, inshallah. So, democracy works, but not always. Okay. So, in this particular section, we're going to be looking at the Quranic argument for God's existence, all right? Now, this particular argument, the thing is that when we look at how arguments are structured within the Quran, what you'll notice is that you will not find structures which we call in the format of discursive reasoning, all right? In the sense that as human beings, we reason in a certain kind of systematic format, right? So we talk about deductive reasoning, right? You have two premises and a conclusion. So that sort of format is not found in the Quran, all right? And the reason being is because, remember, right, Allah knows us better than we know ourselves. And so it's not only rationality, but He's also targeting your fitrah, as we had mentioned, okay? Now, when it comes to the rational arguments as they are presented in the Quran, what happens is that we look at them and then we try to put them in a format such that we can use it in a discursive reasoning format. But we want to be careful with that to say, why did Allah put it in the format that He put it in? So the ayah we're going to be speaking about, bi'idhnillah, is actually in the format of a question. And the question here, because the nature of questions and how questions are put forth, is to get the person to think about things and to think about the options, right? So the ayah in and of itself is very straightforward. So you don't need any sort of deep explanation or anything like that. But you can always, and I was talking to someone yesterday about the Quran being multi-layered and multi-leveled, okay? And it is valid for someone that, let's say, is having doubts about the existence of Allah, but they don't, they haven't delved deeply into intricacies and nuances of philosophy. They're just kind of, I'm just doubting this, right? It's for that person. At the same time, it is also for the person that wants to or is engaged with thinking deeper, able to deal with that as well, okay? So that's the first thing when it comes to this particular ayah. All right. So we'll start with a little bit of a thought experiment, okay? Imagine that you enter into a room and you find yourself, you black out. We always have these blackout experiments, right? You black out and you wake up in a room, okay? This room has no doors, no windows, no way out, no way in, okay? The only thing in this room is this desk that you're seeing and the laptop. And on this laptop, it says this laptop and desk came from nothing. How plausible do you think that is? Do you think like, okay, yeah, that makes total sense? Yeah? It makes total sense? No, it makes no sense. I know it's early, right? It makes no sense. All right, so it doesn't matter what the laptop says or what's there. Point being is that because our first area is going to be talking about nothing, we want to clarify what we mean by nothing. So nothing means no thing, the absence of something. Even though there are very, you can say, sophisticated, philosophers that try to argue that it is possible to get something from nothing. But their definition of nothing is actually something. Okay. Now I know it sounds ridiculous. Okay, and it's just like, why are we just? And it's almost like it's just a syntactic. We're doing syntactic gymnastics. But to be very clear, what we mean by nothing is the absence of something. Okay. So when you have quantum fields and you say, "Oh, that's nothing," no, those are quantum fields. If you have quarks, those are quarks. That is not nothing. Okay. All right. Now, what is the ayah? So the ayah is in chapter 52, verse 35 and 36. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Okay, were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Rather, they are not certain. Okay? Just as a reminder, I have on there, these verses function as a means to awaken the innate disposition. In other words, to uncloud the fitrah, right? That is their first function, right? However, they also provide the logical basis of a universal and powerful argument for the existence of God. And by the way, just on a side note, there was a person in my family, and he was kind of notoriously known to push people's buttons, okay, to just annoy people. And he would do that because he would always kind of drop some sort of strange doubt in the middle of a conversation, then just walk away. I don't know if you know people like this, right? Like people are talking about whatever, the weather and politics or whatever, and he just comes out like, how do you know God exists? And people are like, well, the thing is, and he just walks away. And you're like, wait a minute, why are we talking about this, right? So he would do that and just walk away. So a lot of times, the family members like, does he even believe in God, So I sat him down once, and I'm like, so tell me, what's the deal? And he says, you know what? Like in my entire life, I've dealt with religious people, and I'm not impressed. Like, I don't see what Islam has done for people, right? And so therefore, I actually don't believe in God. Okay. We actually sat down and went through this ayah, and by the time we were done, he goes, no one's ever said that to me, right? And he said that actually makes complete sense, and it makes sense. Like Allah exists, that's true, And so, anyways, now it wasn't that simple, by the way. I know I'm just saying it within 3 seconds. But there was a kind of a process there. Okay, now let's start with the first part, right? Were they created from nothing? خُلِقُوا. Now, again, although the ayah refers to specifically to human beings, it can also be applied to anything that began to exist. All right, so خُلِقُوا, for those who are studying Arabic, is not خَلَقَ. خُلِقُوا means that they were created, made, or originated. Okay, so while in this particular context, it is referring to the human being, but it can be expanded to everything, right? All right. Now, we have to ask the question, did the universe begin to exist? All right? Someone may say, look, we don't really need to entertain the question because the universe has always been around. So when Allah says, were they created from nothing, right? Did the universe come from nothing? The universe doesn't need to come from anything because it's always been here. All right? So how do we respond to that? Anyone want to take a crack? We kind of mentioned it in the dependency argument yesterday. Okay, where's our mic person? Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay.
So if the universe were to have existed eternally, then it wouldn't be possible for us to exist, right? Because if there was no beginning, then there would be no series of events which would lead to our time right now in existence.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. How about, can you give us a practical, some sort of understanding how, because I get what you're saying, right? And most of us, because we've covered the example, get what you're saying. But how would you articulate that to someone that's maybe like, well, what do you mean? So what's the answer to, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
By way of an example. And you can't use my chai example.
Can I use your domino example?
The domino. Okay, you can use the domino example.
Yeah, definitely. So for the dominoes to tip, there has to be an initial cause for that. So the first one has to get tipped. And you can't just keep going back and back until there's literally no cause left. There has to be an initial cause,
sure,
an uncaused cause, right? And then also, there's scientific evidence for all matter splitting.
Don't worry about that, man. We're not
okay.
Don't worry about the scientific evidence. We just we covered science yesterday, right? So don't worry about the scientific stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, something that seems when I heard this was very simple to me is that if it took an infinite amount of time for us to come into existence, then we could not have existed.
Right.
It's very simple.
Sure. Okay, good. So the first contention is that, look, why would Allah mention anything about being created from nothing? Because the universe has always been around. But again, like we said, if that's the issue, or if we make a claim that the universe has always been around, then we're stuck with the problem of the infinite regress of historical events, meaning we would not exist. Like from yesterday, if you remember the chai example that I had, I would never get to drink a karakh cup of chai, right? That karakh chai that I wanted, I would never get it, okay? Everyone remembers that example from yesterday, right? Yeah, we're good on that? Okay. So therefore, finite things had a beginning. You have to understand that right off the bat. Okay? Number two, actual infinite doesn't exist. Because someone may say, okay, the universe began from, it has always existed. It's infinite. A second kind of response to that would be like, look, you can have a mathematical infinite, right, theoretically, but an actual infinite, it doesn't exist. What I mean by that, so if we imagine that, let me just give an example. If we imagine that we had a bag of infinite number of balls, okay, would such a bag be possible in the sense that you have a limited bag that is actually extant and it actually exists? Or would you say like, okay, this number of balls you're going to keep on filling into this bag that is infinite, like how would you actually give an example of the infinite in the physical world is what we're looking at, okay? Because there is no example within the physical world of the infinite, all right? So anyone want to challenge that? Yeah. Okay, but that's exactly what we're arguing, is that the whole concept is that the universe is not infinite, right? So we're saying that it has a finite existence. There's nothing in our observable world that you can say that, look, that thing, that is infinite. There's a mathematical infinite, right? And we can use that to do many things, but there's no actual physical example of the infinite. Yeah. So I think time is a very interesting topic, right? Yeah, so then you have to ask the question, is time physical or is that a metaphysical concept in and of itself, right? And then even time, I don't know if I want to open this bag of worms, but doesn't time necessarily need to have something that it's related to, be related to something in order for you to measure it, to say that yes, time is there, right? Meaning you can't, like time as an abstract concept, it's fine, we can talk about time, but like understanding time means, for instance, you understand days and nights, which is contingent upon understanding the earth and the sun, and they have a relationship. Therefore, you can understand time, right, which is known as serial time. Our understanding of time is contingent, right? Time itself, that's a separate concept altogether, right? But I'm saying in a physical understanding of time, you could argue that that is a metaphysical concept that is dependent upon interlocking concepts that have to do with physical entities, right? Does that make sense? In terms of, okay, what else? What other? Is it too early for me to be like pushing you guys? Okay. And there's other thought experiments you can do in this area. So stacking an infinite number of cubes, you would never be able to stack an infinite number of cubes and have a definite stack of cubes, right? If you're stacking them forever, okay? So there's no example within the physical world of an infinite. So in the physical world, it doesn't exist. Yeah. Yeah, go for it. A road? Which road is this? Oh, okay. Hypothetical. Okay.
6 meters per second. Can you repeat the question, please? And then you're driving at 3 meters per second. There's no question because because the sisters need to hear you. Okay. So the question that the Sheikh had was, can there be a physical example of an infinite thing, right? So if you assume there's a road that grows at 6 meters per second and you're driving at 2 meters per second, the road will exist in the physical world ad infinitum, and you will never reach its end. Therefore, theoretically speaking, there is a physical example of infinite.
So
and again, like I started, just for the sake of argument.
No, that's good. That's good. Because it's good to like think through these things. So what I would ask then is that necessarily a physical infinite or is that a mathematical infinite? Because we have a hypothetical road, right, which are applying a certain mathematical concept to it, right? So yes, in our perception of this hypothetical, the road is physical. The concept of justifying infinite, however, what you use is mathematical, right? So I'm saying that yes, mathematical infinite does exist, right? And we use that all the time in such an example. But in the physical world, you can't give a physical example and say, look, this thing, it's infinite, right? So I think that's where you would have a, that's where you'd be able to kind of see that there's a difference between mathematical infinite and a physical infinite. But it's good point, mashallah. Jazakallah khair. Okay, let's move on. So remember, this actually goes back to the dependency argument, right? Things with limited physical quantities do not give rise to their own limitations. We spoke about this when we spoke about the argument from contingency and the argument from dependency. So I'm not going to get in and repeat this because I think you guys, we squeezed your brains down to the core and down to the limit, okay? So let's now come to the ayah itself and let's look at the flow of the ayah, okay? How does it go? So it starts off, let me come back to that, inshallah. Yeah. So the logic of the ayah itself, all right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Am khuliqu min ghayri shay. Were they created from nothing, all right? Or are they the creators of themselves? Did they create themselves? Were they self-created? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? In other words, were they created from something else that was created? Rather, they are not certain, okay? And there we've got if all three of these, the answer to that is no, then by logical necessity, they have to come from something that is uncreated, okay? And so this forms a type of, as we said, a deductive form of an argument. Now again, this is not how the Quran formulates it. This is for us to understand it and articulate it, all right? So let's start from nothing, all right? Were we created from nothing? So what do we mean by nothing? By nothing, when we're defining it, we understand that there's no prior causal conditions, okay? So remember, yesterday we said that it's self-evidently true about cause and effect. What nothing refers to is that there is no prior causal conditions, okay? Nothing also refers to the absence of anything. And anything means like, there's nothing, right? So again, quantum fields, all these things, Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, he eventually ends up saying that it's something, he just wants to call that something nothing, all right? So anyway, it has no potential and it's no thing. It's kind of ridiculous that we're actually getting into details about explaining what is nothing, but on a simple basis, nothing is nothing. It's the absence of something, okay? So can the universe, all of this finite physical reality, come from nothing, right? No prior causal condition. It just pops into existence for a very simple way. Is that possible? Yes. You can. Where's the mic? Inshallah. Hisham, give me water.
So whenever they say the universe came from nothing,
Yeah.
they're just playing with definitions then?
Yeah, I mean, you have to then ask them to explain, what do you mean by nothing?
Oh, okay.
Right? If it's, I think, you can have the universe come from nothing. Okay, fine, that's fine. Jazakallah khair. That's fine as an assertion. You can assert that, but how, like conceptually, there's no way to substantiate that. Like, it came from nothing, but what does that even mean? And eventually, if you boil it down, no matter how technical you get, right? For those of you who love science, quantum fields and all those things, I mean, you're still relying on something, right? Something that has some sort of prior causal condition. What we're saying is, there's no prior causal condition to what has come about. That's what we mean by nothing. If there's a prior causal condition, right, then that thing that you're referring to is not nothing. Does that make sense? Okay. You want to hand the mic back, inshallah.
I would say that if we are saying that something is coming from nothing, it means it is ever existed. Then it means it's a creator, not being created.
Okay, yeah. So I think you're jumping to the conclusion, but yeah, that's where we're eventually going to get to, inshallah. Okay, so can a universe come from nothing? Well, from nothing, nothing comes, all right? All right, so zero, I mean, mathematically, 0 plus 0 plus 0 is equal to 0. And at the end of the day, the logical implications and equivalence are just absurd, right? No one practically thinks that they can get something from nothing, okay? And then things don't just pop into being, right? You're not in court and, in front of the judge, and the judge is like, well, why were you speeding? Well, this leprechaun just popped into existence and put my foot on the gas, and so it's not me, right? So it's just no one uses that as in any sort of real sense, okay? So the first option, can the universe and everything come from nothing? It's a no, okay? What's the second well, okay, here are the main objections. Does causality make sense outside of the universe, all right? Here what we're talking about, they're saying, okay, the only reason that you're saying that something can't come from nothing is because those are the rules in the universe. You're saying there's no physical example, but outside the universe, maybe there's some sort of place or area or reality where something can come from nothing. Causality only makes sense in the universe. All right, how would you respond to that? What do you think? Where's the mic? Okay, go for it.
You would say that the burden of proof is on them to prove that?
Okay, that's a good point, right? Going back to self-evident truths, yeah.
In that sense, they basically disprove themselves because, they're the ones that said that there's no cause, but then they immediately retract the statement saying that, oh, there is actually a cause. It's outside of the universe in a world, a magical fantasy place where the laws of our world don't apply. So, no matter how they twist it, they still come back to the point that, okay, there is a cause.
Okay. So I think what the contention here is that does the very concept of causality make sense outside the universe? So it's a bit different, right? They're not saying that, yes, there is a cause, and I've capitulated on that. What they're saying is this whole concept of cause and effect, that outside the universe, that might not apply, right? And so, therefore, there is a possibility that you could get something from nothing, right? So just to kind of go ahead and move forward, what is the logical link between these things? That's what the issue is, okay? So even if there was, let's say hypothetically, right, this area where causality doesn't exist, fair enough, but then what does that have to do with something coming from nothing, right? You're still left with a problem. Does that make sense? Does the contention make sense versus the response? Yes. Let me get you the mic.
So if they're saying that something came from nothing in a different universe, and that only happened once, why wouldn't it continuously happen in this universe?
Sure.
Why,
you could argue that.
Once.
Right. Yeah,
well,
you could argue that.
Yeah.
Right. But again, what they're saying is the only reason you can say you as a Muslim or whatever, you can justify causality is because it makes sense in the universe that you exist in, right? But perhaps there's a universe where that rule doesn't exist, right? I mean, the problem with hypotheticals is that when they start pushing you for proving the existence of God, but yet they then kind of rely on something where there's no sort of evidence whatsoever. You can hypothetically make all sorts of things, right? And they do, right? What if there was a multiverse? Okay, but is there evidence of a multiverse? Okay, what if there's so many what ifs, right? The issue is that, remember, I always said that kufr will always contradict itself. You will always find inconsistencies in how they're able to express something. So it's a matter of finding those inconsistencies, even when the contentions are pushed to say, okay, well, does causality make sense outside the universe? Be like, okay, well, what does that have to do with the universe coming from nothing, right? It's still, how does that undermine the argument? Right? What's the logical connection?
The other thing I would argue is these guys, they only believe in the seen, a reaction.
Okay. Sure.
Why are you talking about the unseen? You haven't seen that.
Right.
Why are you talking about that?
Perhaps, yeah. That might be. But when people want to argue, they're not gonna go back to again, inconsistency, right? Yeah.
So I'd like to share a brief anecdote, but basically, I think a few years ago I'd spoken to a cosmologist from the University of Chicago who's actually a researcher at Argonne National Laboratories, and his PhD was actually in subatomic field theory, so he has very strong grounding in, of course, the origins of the universe and whatnot. And I had sort of brought up this sort of, and I wasn't as sort of educated as I am sort of now, but of this sort of cause and effect argument to him, because I think from the way I had spoken to him, I could sense that he had sort of a more naturalist paradigm. And this is actually something that he said. when I said, when I sort of brought up this point that everything that begins to exist has a cause, therefore, and the universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause. He said that actually, with the very beginning of time, conditions were so extreme, like in terms of temperature and heat, and sort of the environment was so absurd and beyond our like even comprehension that our understanding of cause and effect may not have even been sort of plausible. Sure. So then in that sense, he said that, we actually don't know if cause and effect even would have existed at that time period. Sure. So then I was sort of confused on how to sort of respond in that sense.
Yeah, because then it moves from empirical analysis to belief, right? Because there was so much so that we could not have, okay, but that's an assertion. I mean, if you're going to stick with your philosophical naturalism, that we can only have explanations by way of physical phenomena, okay, then you've broken your own rule, right? So either everything can be explained by way of physical phenomena or everything cannot, right? If it can't, then you have to at least concede that that is not, that is not part of, let's say, empirical analysis. That is a part of belief. Like, that is an assumption and an assertion. That's it.
But another point that he mentioned was he also said that he doesn't think that absolute truth exists within the natural world, but the only means to attaining absolute truth is through logic and mathematics. Is that a correct statement?
I mean, that is a means, but that's not the only way. And then what do you mean by absolute truth?
Like, for something to be...
What does he mean by absolute truth, rather?
Like in the examples you're giving about connecting drawing a conclusion from multiple premises, that's something that is undeniably true. Like, for a person to reject that would be sort of nonsensical, right? Sure. But that's a logical argument. Yeah. There's no rationality to that. There's no something, you're not deriving, like the bachelor one you gave, there's no like physical phenomenon that it deals with. There's no sort of...
Sure, but even I would push him on that and say, well, why is that necessarily true? Because remember, you have to have first principles, okay? Now, to push him and say, like, okay, so what are the first principles you're relying upon? Now, that's one that you've stated, that's the only way to truth, let's say mathematical and logic, but why is that the only way to truth, right? And how do you then justify, or let's say understand your first principles, right? So I agree, but then if someone were to say, okay, I disagree with logic itself, then where do you go with that? Like, how do you deal with that from his paradigm?
But how would you connect logic to the natural world? That's what I want to understand. Like, how could you say things are definitely true in the natural world? Like in the same
way, things definitely true in the natural
world?
Absolutely
true in the same way that you can do for logical sort of conclusions.
So again, what I would say is you have to connect his first principles, right? So if you were to ask me, like, how do you connect them? Well, that's pretty simple. You've got your fitrah, right? And your fitrah recognizes the natural world. So for us, that paradigm is very clear and consistent. The problem is that to be consistent in a worldview relying upon philosophical naturalism, you then have to either capitulate on the initial claim that we can only explain things by way of physical phenomena, or then you have to at least entertain the idea that your first principles, you can't have that as a stopping point. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Things that can come from nothing, quantum vacuum, I spoke about that. Quantum vacuum is something, right? There's a prior causal connection there, there's a prior cause there, right? So prior causal condition. All right. Does causality make sense outside of time? We addressed that when you asked about time, right? So you kind of foreshadowed that. And Lorentz crosses nothing is in fact something, because even when he digs down and says, okay, so there's a possibility, let's say, by way of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth, that by way of quarks, things can come about. Problem is quarks and fields and things like that, that is still something. Remember, nothing is the absence of something, right? There's no causal conditions that allow something to come about. That's what we mean by nothing, okay? So that being the case, that is a causal condition, which means that it is a something, all right? So that's not nothing. Does that make sense? I know that's almost, yeah. Does causality make sense outside the universe? Okay, so what I had mentioned is that so an easy way to understand that, we initially, were you here when we spoke about naturalism? You were, okay. Does causality make sense out of the universe? The easy way of responding to that is say, but doesn't that run antagonist to your own perception of how you explain things, right? Because You can only, according to you, only explain things by way of natural phenomena, and you're limited to that. Now you're saying, that there's a possibility that causality may not make sense outside the universe, but now you have capitulated to say there are things outside the universe that are not according to naturalistic processes, right? So take your pick. Either you say there's no metaphysical concepts outside the universe, right? And then we can have a conversation. Or everything is physical and can only be described by way of physical processes, in which case what you're saying, does causality make sense outside the universe? You can't, under your own perception and paradigm, justify that. So you have to kind of say you got to pick one or the other, right? Does that make sense to everyone? Yes? Okay, good, inshallah. Okay, so a conflation between the theological nothing, meaning no material stuff, and the philosophical nothing, right? No prior causal conditions. Someone would say, isn't God something? Right? They'd be like, well, so clearly God creates out of nothing. So then therefore, how can you say that things, there's a possibility according to your worldview? So again, there's a conflation between the theological nothing, meaning no material stuff, and the philosophical nothing, no prior causal conditions. These are two separate things, okay? When we say that Allah creates out of nothing, we're saying that there's no material things, okay? But Allah still has a will. There's still, from that perspective, that is still something, okay? There's the will of Allah, right? There is the actions of Allah and so on and so forth. Those are still things. When we say nothing, we're saying that we're defining nothing as no prior causal conditions, okay? But Allah does cause things by His will and so on and so forth, okay? So does everyone understand why this becomes, yeah. Let's get the mic.
In that case, when you bring up the argument, couldn't an atheist just basically point fingers back at you and say like, oh, well, you just define nothing as no prior causal conditions and the absence of anything. But then now you're saying nothing is something, it is divine will and divine power. So how do you respond to an argument like that?
So that's what we're saying, is that they're conflating they're conflating the theological nothing, right? In terms of what we're saying. So we're saying that when we say that Allah creates out of nothing, that there's no material matter, right? There's nothing material, and Allah basically kun fayakun, and He creates something, right? Mm-hmm. But the philosophical nothing is meaning that there's no cause, like there's no cause whatsoever. There's no causal conditions to have something come about, right? So if you remember my example of things popping into existence, that's in essence what we're saying, is that without any sort of causal condition, that's what we mean by nothing. And that's like, how do you substantiate that, right? That doesn't negate the idea that Allah can create out of nothing, right? There's two separate things here. One is physical stuff, like Allah has created physical things out of nothing, right? But that nothing is actually something. In other words, it is His will, okay? Nothing from a philosophical point of view is that there's no causal conditions whatsoever. It's just there's an absence of something. There's an absence of conditions. There's an absence of everything. Make sense? I don't know. I know it gets a bit this thing. Okay.
Won't that sort of reasoning open the door of like more definitions of nothing? Like, I don't know, but like from my perspective, like going down this rabbit hole can open the door for like accepting Lawrence Krauss's ridiculous definition of what nothing is.
Okay. Why? How so?
Because an atheist could argue that, okay, so you have two separate definitions of nothing. Why not add a third definition?
Sure. So, according to your worldview, right? So we're saying, according to your worldview, you're saying, or let's agree, right, that nothing is the absence of prior causal conditions. Okay? According to you, right? According to your rules. Now, if you want to take my rules, where God exists, then we can entertain the causal condition being God. But that's what we're saying is, according to you and your definition, when we're talking about nothing, we're talking about prior causal conditions. There's the absence of a causal condition, right? And we're saying that you can get something from no causal conditions. That's what they're arguing, right? If they're going to argue nothing, okay? Again, for the theist, we're not arguing that. We're saying, no, there is a cause, right? There are causal conditions, right? That's exactly what we're arguing. Does that make sense?
So a theist position is basically no material matter.
Yeah,
Like-
so when we say Allah creates out of nothing, we're saying no material matter, all right? That's a theological position, all right? But the philosophical position, which is what the atheist is now arguing, because he can't take a theological position. Otherwise, that presupposes he already believes in God, right? So a philosophical position, no prior causal conditions. It just happens. There's an absence of conditions, there's absence of everything. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay, good. All right. So something coming from nothing is impossible. Nothing implies non-being, no potential, and no causal conditions. However, God is unique with the potential to create and brings things into existence. He provides, i.e., he provides causal activity. He has a will and he has a power, right? He has irada and he has qudra, all right? Therefore, it is not the case of something coming from nothing. God wills and power are the causal conditions to bring the universe into existence, all right? So hopefully that's clarified that contention. Does that make sense? Yes? Everyone good with that? You sure? I know it's early. Okay. All right. Let's go to the second option. So remember the ayah said, Am khuliqu min ghayri shay, am humul khaliqun. All right. So were they created from nothing, or did they create themselves? All right. Now this one is pretty. I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay. When a person would assert, if the second option is okay, we'll put nothing. We've already agreed that something can't come from nothing. Then did things create themselves? But there's a logical problem here, right? Because it preassumes the existence of something in order for that thing to exist, okay? So it's like a mother giving birth to herself, to put it very simply, all right? Which, again, is a logical impossibility, okay? So can something exist and not exist at the same time? Can your mother give birth to herself, all right? So, yeah, get the mic real quick.
Actually, that's another argument you can argue against Christians, that when they believe that God is also Jesus, but how can God create Himself? Like, how can God be born but He already existed? That's another argument you can argue against them. That too. I just want to mention it. I think it's great.
Jazakallah khair. So Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, he mentions this is even more fallacious. This is an even more fallacious argument, because if something does not exist, how can it be described as having power, and how could it create anything? How could it do anything? If these two arguments are refuted, then it is established that they have a creator, so let them believe in him. Okay? So again, the deductive form of the argument is this. All right? So we've covered, so basically, there are four options. So let's now look at this in a deductive format. Okay? If option 1 is not true, then you have to go to option 2. If option 2 is not true, then you have to go to option 3. If these 3 options, they're all false, option 4 by logical necessity has to be true. All right? That's why we said that this is a deductive form of the argument. There is no other place, as long as 1, 2, and 3 have been dealt with, 4 necessarily has to be the resulting option. Okay? And that's why this argument is very straightforward and very powerful. Okay? So we've dealt with created from nothing. We've dealt with self-created. In fact, self-created is very, very straightforward. All right? So now, what if someone says, no, but it was created by something else that was created? All right? Because that's the third option. All right? So let's going back to the diagram. Or did they create the heavens and the earth? All right? So in other words, were they created from something else that it itself was created? All right? That's your third option. So again, if you remember the infinite regress of past events, that's an impossibility, because if that was the case, you wouldn't be here. We wouldn't exist, right? So to say that something was created from something which was created from something, and that went on forever, then the initial you would not exist. There has to be, by logical necessity, something outside of this chain that started the process, okay? And so, and then, by the way, this is Sheikh Jafar Idris. He said there would be no series of actual causes, but only a series of non-existence. The fact, however, is that there are existence around us. Therefore, their ultimate cause must be something other than temporal causes, okay? And Imam al-Ghazali mentions the same can be said of the cause of the cause. Now, this can either go on ad infinitum, which is absurd, or it will come to an end. that being the case, it is the only option that it has to be created by something that itself was uncreated. All right? And so hence, the understanding that there's an uncreated creator is a logical necessity when you start weighing out all the other options that are competing against it. Okay? So, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, like He neither begets nor is He born. He is the first. There's nothing before you, as the dua in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ mentions, "Oh God, you are the first. There's nothing before you. You are the last, and there's nothing after you." Okay, so that was the argument in a nutshell. So, any questions about that? How many people? Yeah. So let me get you the mic.
All right, so I just had a question with regards to the self-created portion of the argument.
Okay.
The self-created postulation.
Sure.
How would you deal with somebody that brings up arguments of let's say quantum particles, which are known to I believe either exist in two states or have existence and non-existence at the same time. So how would you deal with somebody that brings up the argument oh wait, quantum particles exist and don't exist at the same time?
Okay. What do they mean by exist? You have to really get down and understand how are they defining exist, right? Is it a logical definition? Something is being and not being at the same time, right? Because again, it gets back to, I know we use these things in our vernacular, right? They exist and they don't exist, but what do you mean by that, right? So that's what I would say is that you really have to boil down and say, okay, what is it that you're referring to here, right? You want to add to that?
Sorry, I'd just like to comment on what you just said.
Sure, go
So
ahead.
this is actually a phenomenon that I studied recently because I'm a biochemistry student. So studying general chemistry, you cover the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And there's a fundamental understanding within the scientific fields that models don't explain reality. And this is something my professor reiterated multiple times throughout the course, is that these are all models, and it is, so many of them can be mathematically proven. Like in this situation where you're talking about how a quantum particle can exist and not exist at the same time, this has been mathematically proven.
Sure.
To simplify it down, basically, there are atoms and then there are subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and electrons basically can exist in a specific position. Like imagine, Fahad, imagine you were standing right here, and rationally, in order for you to get to the other side of the room, you would have to move from this point and traverse every single position until you got to that point, right?
Sure.
But what an electron can do, actually, according to this model, is you can exist here and exist at that side of the room, but you can never exist anywhere in between, and you can actually move back and forth without ever existing at any position in between these two locations. Right. And that's mathematically proven.
Sure.
But then again, it's just a model. And a model is not a clear explanation of reality because there are multiple scientific models, and they're always changing. They're mutable, like you mentioned.
Right.
So it's not always because if you're relying on this for your own explanation of reality, then you're gonna actually lead yourself into a bit of an issue because they're always changing.
Sure. But I would add to that. Now you mentioned that if it's a mathematical model, remember we said that certain things within mathematics are possible. You can have an infinite, right? But they're not possible within the physical world, right? So just because you can mathematically show, let's say, existence and non-existence at the same time, it doesn't model the physical world, right? And I think last night I had mentioned that even mathematically, if I wanted to traverse the room, I'd have to go from this point to the door, which means I'd have to cross the halfway point, right? But then I'd have to cross the halfway point of the halfway point. But then I have to cross the halfway point of the halfway point of the half. So I would never be able to mathematically be able to cross the room, right? But physically I can get up and just walk over there. So mathematical models are very useful, like you mentioned, but at the same time, they don't necessarily reflect reality, right? So, and if that's where you're at, then be careful in that realm, inshallah.
See, that's exactly where I'm having the issue.
Okay.
Because I'm going to kind of go to calculus 2, right? If you take an integral of a certain period of time,
okay,
right, of something happening in that period of time, the probability of that happening is 0.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? But if you take an integral of something happening from the beginning to the end the probability of that happening is a 1.
Okay.
Right? So that means that if you look at infinity, the probability of something happening in an infinite time span, there's a very high possibility that that thing would happen.
Okay. Okay. Jazakallah khair. Appreciate that. I'm not sure if I understood it, but Jazakallah khair.
So no, so the point I'm making is if you're traversing
right
from that side of the room
sure.
to that side of the room,
right.
if you look at an infinite period of time,
yeah.
that there's a possibility that you would traverse from that side of the room to that side of the room.
Right. But an actual infinite doesn't exist. Is that what you're saying? Like the actual infinite, like I would need an actual
But if you're talking
infinite,
about infinity, right?
Right.
Something happening forever.
Yeah.
That it could happen per mathematical.
Right, for a mathematical model. Right. But that's exactly what hopefully I articulated that well, is that mathematics doesn't necessarily represent the real world, right? So I don't know if that, again, I haven't studied that stuff in a long time. I think the last time I took a class on multivariable calculus was like 20 years ago. So it was a long time. So I'm going to trust you on that, inshallah. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break. I'm going to bring up the other slides. I need to actually find them. So get up, take a break, walk around, and we'll reconvene, inshallah, in 5 minutes. Jazakumullah khair. Yeah, but
Assalamu alaikum. As we were setting things up with the presentation, I just came across some brothers from out of state, and I understand there's some sisters also from out of state. So since this is our last couple hours before the program ends, definitely wanted to make sure that any of you who are visiting first time or visiting from locally or out of state from first time, you can definitely, I would encourage you to take a tour of the seminary, the library, and other classrooms and so forth, alhamdulillah, before you head back home. So between now and Dhuhr, or immediately before Dhuhr, or immediately after Dhuhr, we have students here, both on this and volunteers on the sister side and the brother side. Just go up to myself or any of the volunteers and just ask. And I think it would be great, alhamdulillah, since you came out here to be able to see the seminary and all the classrooms, the library, the gym, and where do students usually study. Classes resume tomorrow morning because this is a weekend, obviously. But if you're in town this weekend, or Monday, I mean, you're more than welcome to come by and visit and audit some of the classes. If this weekend sparks some interest in studying, then you can take it to the next step by coming and visiting the seminary during the last week of our Arabic intensive is this week, inshallah. And also I want to, mashallah, just speaking of a few brothers here, our one-year program, our 11th batch of one-year students will be starting next Monday, a week from tomorrow. So if yourself or you know anyone else is interested in furthering the Islamic knowledge in Arabic, Islamic studies, Aqidah, Seerah, Fiqh, Tajweed, Tazkiyah, mentorship, public speaking, and a whole bunch of other things that are taught here for 11 months to both boys and girls, men and women, 7:40 to 4:15 every day, Monday through Friday. And then on Saturdays, we have a shorter day, 3 hours. This program, as I said, is in its 11th year. And we've graduated, alhamdulillah, hundreds of students. Just last year, about 75 or so graduated from across the country. We have about 75 enrolled, I think so, 670 or 75 enrolled for this year. So a lot of them are from out of state as well. So you might have been hearing about this program before, but you can get a chance to learn about it. The Tanweer Immersion Program. The website is quite detailed. It's got a lot of various aspects of the Tanweer program are highlighted on the website, but there's nothing like coming and sitting and seeing for yourself. So I recommend after the program ends to take a tour. Inshallah, Ahmad Javed is here, Marzouk, the other students will be here to take you around. And the sisters, inshallah, you can reach out to the volunteers. And then tomorrow, come by anytime next week or even the following week to audit a class or two, and that will help answer a lot of your questions. Jazakumullah khairan. Okay, now inshallah we're ready to take the sisters' questions. We have a few sisters' questions, so let's take those first.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihi al-Kareem amma ba'd. Okay, so one question was, what does undifferentiated infinite mean? As far as I know, that is a mathematical concept, right? It's not a philosophical concept. So those who are mathematicians would probably be, are you familiar with what it means? Undifferentiated infinite. As far as I know, it's a mathematical concept. And so we already said that you can have an infinite mathematically. So and however you want to describe that, whatever sort of nuances that come with that, that's perfectly acceptable. But as far as it being an actual infinite, I don't think that has any sort of bearing on whether an actual infinite exists or not. So it is a mathematical concept, inshallah. Another question, if an atheist agrees with you that God is independent, then what about angels? If he can do anything with the snap of his fingers, then why do angels exist? So one thing we want to make sure that we're clear about is yesterday when we were speaking about the argument from dependency, it was solely looking at the fact that there has to, by necessity, be an independent, that the independent has to exist, right? Our belief in angels, is that a logical necessity? No. Okay, hopefully we're all okay. So this is a good chance to kind of review some of the aqidah. Okay, we know about angels because Allah tells us about angels. There's no sort of logical connection to say, okay, now because we believe Allah exists, therefore angels exist. That's not how that works, right? I think the question, which has now disappeared, but anyway, so the question asked, like, I guess, so why does Allah need angels? And so again, Allah doesn't need anything. That is His choice. Like how things functions are by way of angels. Like angels bring rain, angels take the soul of the dead person, and so on and so forth. As we know, that is a choice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that a logical necessity? No. But is it true? Yes. It is logically necessary that the existence of Allah by way of Him being an independent reality is there. What that entails then is that whatever revelation or whatever communication that independent reality has now put forth is true. Okay? And so therefore, I'm not, when I say something like, is it a logical necessity for angels to exist? Some people may say like, oh, so it's not logical? That's not what I'm saying. If we have come to the conclusion that Allah exists, then whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us about is a reality. Okay? So it's not that it's illogical, it's just how you get to that truth is a different process. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Any questions about that? Any clarification? All right. It's a foundational point of aqeedah, inshallah, which is a good question, though. Jazakallah khair. Okay. So, sisters, I think I'm connected. So, did you have any other question before we move on to the next section? Okay. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Okay, wait. So I wasn't able to hear you properly. So if you could you repeat the question? I wasn't able to hear any of it. So if you could just repeat it. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. So, as far as I've understood the question, the sister is asking that while Allah does not have a gender, why does He refer to Himself as He? And in certain cases, we. And she said certain feminists would argue that in fact God is a she. Okay? Now, sister, could I ask you that we can park this question to the end? Actually, you know what? Let's not park it to the end since we are at the end of a section. Let me just go ahead and take it. So, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to Himself as He, this is a function of language. Any person that studied the Arabic language knows that it is a gendered language. It is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicates. Does that necessitate gender as we understand it? No, it doesn't, but that's just how language works, right? It is a function of the language. Does it necessitate one being more dominant than the other? No, it doesn't. The problem that arises is that, and we spoke about worldviews some few days ago, it is the lenses by which you are looking at reality. If the lenses that you are looking at reality is a feminist lens, then yes, the choice of he would be something to say, okay, well, this is just substantiating and bolstering the idea of the tyrannical patriarchy that is found in all religious texts. But that's not the case. And we had said a few days ago that in fact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has different classifications, different names and attributes, and some scholars classify them in two broad categories, right? You have names that are Jalali and names that are Jamali, right? Some scholars do this, right? So Jamali names are those names related to like beauty, okay? That's Jamali, yani, okay? Jalali refer to those attributes that are related to majesty. So the attributes of Allah being, that He is powerful, He's strong and mighty, and so on and so forth, right? And He is Shadidul Iqab, and so on. Those are all Jalali, relating to Allah's majesty, okay? Then you have Jamali attributes. He is Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman, right? Al-Wudud, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that within the human being, right, one of the things that Ibn al-Qayyim mentions is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants His servants to emulate some of His names, okay? Not that we're doing some sort of concept of we're going to become Allah. But as Ibn al-Qayyim says, Allah is Ar-Rahman and He loves for His servants to have mercy, right? Allah is Al-Alim and He loves for His servants to have knowledge, right? And so on. Allah is the Al-Adl, He's the one that is just, and He loves for His servants to have justice, right? In this concept where we see that we're trying to get closer to Allah by way of emulating Allah, certain people have been created with certain dispositions, with attributes that are stronger in certain areas. So when it comes to the attributes of Jamal, the female gender, by and large, has a leg up in terms of things like mercy, for instance. In fact, the term mercy, rahmah, comes from rahm, right? As we know from the prophetic narrations, right? So that concept that women have a leg up when it comes to mercy, okay, fair enough. But men have a leg up, let's say, when it comes to physical, biological power, right? By and large, these are generalities. I'm not saying this is always the case, but by and large. Now, does that mean that because there's this hierarchy in different attributes that there's some sort of concept of injustice? No. In fact, one of the most beautiful aspects of Islam is that it encourages families, these two genders, to come together, right? That they come together and complement one another. So when it comes to the worship of Allah, you are coming together and both of you are taking your strengths, helping each other with your weaknesses, and having an understanding of that. So when it comes to this concept of, okay, well, he referred to himself as he, it's actually a very shallow argument to say, okay, well, there's some sort of patriarchy that's hidden within the Quran, right? Yes, there is a difference between genders, but those differences do not mean a difference in value. Yesterday, I don't know if I had mentioned this, but I mentioned this in the khutbah I did. I said we believe in an equality of value, and we say that is not the same as an identicality of roles. These are two separate things. Equality of value, identicality of roles. These are two separate things. We believe in an equality of value. Allah has valued everyone equally, and that everyone has the opportunity to increase their value because that value is not contingent upon the color of your skin, your gender, your height, your age, your intelligence, none of that. What it's contingent upon, it is the level of taqwa, right? Inna akramakum indallahikum atqakum. Indeed, the most honored of you is the one that has the most taqwa. And taqwa is open to everyone, whatever your intellectual level is, whatever your height is, whatever your color is, whatever your ability is. It is open to everyone, right? But now, that being the case, equality of value is not the same as identicality of roles. Allah did not make us exactly the same. And one of the problems with the feminist movement itself was that they moved, if you study kind of the historical genealogy, first wave feminism was related to the concept of voting rights, okay? So we call women's suffrage. So by 1920s, in this country, they were given voting rights, but even that, it wasn't perfect, okay? So 1920s, most states said, okay, women can now vote. Although some states had said that the condition is that they have to own property, the problem is that the states didn't allow them to own property. So even the voting rights that were given, they were given in a very kind of loose way, right? And I always find this interesting, this is what I mentioned in the khutbah, is that political participation for women, and I know it's not the exact same when we talk about democratic participation, but women's suffrage actually comes 1,400 years late. Because when it came to political participation,